Hello, Open Spokes. It's Tuesday, and this is Ben Wolkoff. This week's question is about reconciling the fact that I am teaching in a way that is different than the way I was taught. And this question is super important to me, but rather than answering it directly, I'd like to talk about an experience I had when I was in the 11th grade. My favorite class and my favorite teacher was AP English 11, taught by Mr. Panikvar. And he would start every class period with a question of his own. And that question was, what do you want to know? He would put his feet up on the desk and he would ask it. And we would have to look through our books to find passages that we thought were interesting and relevant, to ask him questions or to talk about them and debate them. Otherwise, if we ran out of them, or if we stopped being interesting and stopped debating, then we would have a quiz. And it was our job to push that quiz off indefinitely, trying to make sure that there was enough content and that we were getting enough out of it so that either we would do really well on the quiz, and they were always short answer essay questions, or that we did it so long that the period would just be over and we will have just discussed the book on our own mostly throughout the entire period. And that was pretty much his lesson plan, I would say probably 70% of the time. And so while that is drastically different than the way in which I think most of us teach, it actually is pretty central to the types of questions that we ask and that we want students to be able to do. When I think about the question of what do you want to know, it's a really student-centric question, right? Something that I want. It is something that I would generally say is self-directed if I'm the student. I am plotting my own path, and I'm actually gathering resources, right? Usually the night before I would look through and obviously read the passage, but I would look for those particular points that I wanted to talk about the next day. So I was doing a little bit of research and a little bit of planning, and then I was bringing in those resources to help my fellow classmates to push back or beat back the quiz that was coming to us. And so while I would agree that I teach differently than that, and that I incorporate more collaboration perhaps in the way in which I ask questions, and there's definitely a little bit more data that happens where I am thinking through an individualized path, or I'm thinking through how it is that I'm going to gather outside resources outside of the text. It isn't that much different from the best class that I had when I was learning. Now, that's not to say that it is not leaps and bounds different from the worst class that I had when I was learning, where we were really just doing vocabulary exercises in social studies context, sociology, and things like that. But when I think about the way in which we learn, the way that I learn best, I don't think that it is diametrically opposed to how I learned then. It is simply more connected. And so I keep on thinking about how do you connect that question of what do you want to know to more of the things that we do now, where we actually start a collaborative document and then build off of it. How would we structure a classroom where that was it? In a connected classroom, in an online or blended learning environment, how would we structure that question of what do you want to know into that context? Because I think, to a certain extent, that's all that I am trying to do. That's all that I'm trying to do, is to find a way to incorporate the question of what do you want to know into my everyday teaching life. And so the way that I reconcile it is by paying respect to that legacy and by trying to do that work. And I think the challenge that I would have for all of the fellowship is, how are you incorporating this question of what do you want to know into student learning, into adult learning that you are working with? How are you incorporating that question? And is that the right one to be asking? I feel very proud, in a sense, of the legacy that Mr. Panikvar left for me. And I feel very proud of education in general, that it does have this legacy of asking good questions. But I do think that we are further along, and I do think that there are new ways to ask that question that bring about better answers, and not just for the students who are typically engaged in an AP class. Because to a certain extent, while I was doing that question was not being asked of the remedial English class in 11th grade. And the students that were in that class didn't want to answer that question either. So how do we make that work for everyone, and not just the AP kids or the kids who are already engaged in the learning process? How do we make that work for everyone? I guess that's my challenge this week. So I look forward to hearing what you are thinking about, and I will see you all tomorrow.